Hey, Alex, how you doing?
It's actually not the right question to ask because these miserable topics that we cover, I feel bad that I'm actually have something to eat when I am perfectly safe and well.
Well, that is a good signal of the thing that we're talking about today, which is a very bad thing, of course, as you just noted. I'll go ahead and introduce us and that topic that we are going to be diving into. I am Connor Eccles, the managing editor of NonZero and the host of this podcast, which is NonZero World. And you are Alex DeWall, the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at Tufts and a longtime expert in famines. Of course, the mass starvation event, the famine that we're going to be talking about today, is the unfolding tragedy happening in Gaza. And I want to jump into that in a second. One note of housekeeping for listeners before we get going. NonZero World will take off next week because I will be on vacation, but we'll be back the following week. So for the main conversation, I think it'll be useful in a second to do maybe a chronology of everything that's happened over the past, it's almost 20 odd months now. But before we do that, I think getting a little bit of a sense of where we're at today and how it compares to other crises would be helpful for listeners. So you've described the situation in Gaza as, quote, the most intense starvation catastrophe of recent decades. Can you describe exactly what that means and how it compares to other food crises?
So there's sadly been plenty of food crises and incidents of mass starvation tipping into famine in recent years. Um, and the reason I chose the word intense for Gaza is that it is located in a particular place, and it unfolded very rapidly at the beginning of the war between October 2023 over the first 6 months, in which you had a population that was very well nourished, actually had very good health services, plenty of good food, low rates of malnutrition, that then very, very rapidly descended into a level of humanitarian emergency, food insecurity, levels of malnutrition that would be familiar to places like Somalia and South Sudan. Um, it wasn't the biggest, and it still isn't the biggest. So in terms of the overall numbers of people affected, Sudan, for example, today is far larger. There are about 8 million people in Sudan in the same overall condition that people of Gaza are in. Nearly 1 million people in Sudan suffering from famine. And of course, if we go back in history, there are famines that kill millions, even tens of millions. So Gaza, on the sort of the world historic scale, isn't one of the biggest famines, but it has two features that are very unique. One is the speed and intensity with which it unfolded, and the second is the degree of control over what is happening that is exercised by Israel.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk through the chronology a little bit. Can you walk us through, all the way up to today, I think would be helpful. I might jump in at points, but, how we went from a relatively food stable population to this sort of near famine to famine level over and over.
So let's start actually before the outbreak of this recent war in October of 2023, sparked by Hamas's attack and atrocities against Israelis and the various crimes, including the capturing of hostages. Now, what characterized Gaza before that was that although people actually had adequate nutrition, everything was controlled by Israel. Israel had the capacity for controlling pretty much everything that went into Gaza. There was a famous statement by one of the advisors to a previous prime minister. He said, we'll keep the Gazans on a diet. We don't want them to suffer starvation. So Israel controlled the water, the electricity, the food, etc. So that was the background. So the day after, or 2 days after, I think, the attack by Hamas, Israel basically did a couple of things. First of all, they imposed a complete blockade and siege, and initially at first this was a total blockade. Nothing was allowed in. And then they also launched initially an aerial attack and then followed by a ground offensive. And these two elements then unfolded side by side. One was blockade and siege, stopping not only humanitarian aid from going in, but essential services and commercial supplies, and also destroying systematically a lot of what was required for human survival. So there is not a lot of food grown in Gaza, but the orchards, the gardens, some of the fields were destroyed. Fishing was destroyed. Water supplies were seriously damaged. Electricity was damaged, and there was a sustained attack on the healthcare system. So actually, the war crime of starvation isn't just food; it's objects indispensable to survival. So a few months later, when the International Criminal Court brought charges against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, it was referring to destruction of all these things, not just obstructing or destroying food. Mm-hmm. So the situation deteriorated very, very fast. And there was a pause at the end of November, December of 2023 when some hostages were released and some international aid went in. And then we first began to get a picture of how bad it was. And those who sort of work on humanitarian data were shocked how bad it got. And it continued to deteriorate. And in about March last year, several things happened. So this was about after 5-6 months. One was that the UN has its own humanitarian data system. It has a cumbersome title, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Mechanism, the IPC. And the US government has something called the Famine Early Warning System Network, FuseNet. And they both said Gaza is on the brink of famine. Mm. And at the same time, there were some attacks. There had been attacks on aid workers throughout, but at end of March, beginning of April of last year, international aid workers were getting killed, World Central Kitchen and so on. And the Biden administration, under pressure from members of the Senate, began to put pressure on Israel to allow in more aid. And the specific issue there was that the administration, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, needed to certify to Congress that Israel was not obstructing US humanitarian aid. Because if it was found to be obstructing that aid, the US couldn't continue supplying it with arms. And there was quite a controversy at the time because the members of USAID, the US Agency for International Development, who were deputed to prepare the report, began by documenting all the obstruction of aid. And then they were booted off the committee. Mm. And because what Blinken wanted to report was that aid was not being obstructed. And as soon as he prepared that report and delivered it to Congress, allowing the weapons supplies to continue, Israel, which had begun to relax aid restrictions, had over a period of March into April, had allowed more aid in. As soon as Blinken testified in May, aid was massively restricted again. Mm-hmm. And when it was restricted, they also restricted humanitarian data gathering. So we really haven't had properly reliable humanitarian data from Gaza for over a year. And I might add, no international journalists have been allowed in. So the information we have is incomplete. Right. So things really then began to deteriorate again quite sharply until the ceasefire that accompanied the Trump administration coming in at the beginning of this year. So from about January until the beginning of March, there was a ceasefire, more aid was allowed in, and things began to stabilize. Then the ceasefire broke. First of all, from the 2nd of March onwards, Israel once again imposed a total blockade. And then later on in March, began a new military offensive. And by the middle of May, it was clear that the food situation was going to become catastrophic. Even though things had maybe stabilized at the beginning of this year, the sort of the resilience, the reserves, the capacity of the Palestinian population in Gaza had been so reduced that they were going very, very rapidly into mass starvation. So in May, the UN drew up a new plan, and it said, Israel has demanded all these specifications to make sure, these controls, these monitoring, to make sure aid does not fall into the hands of Hamas. We're going to have the most rigorous system ever, with every aid shipment being tracked, every commodity being QR coded, every beneficiary being followed up. But instead of agreeing to that, what Israel did was it brought in a new mechanism called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, GHF. And instead of bringing aid to where the people were, delivering it into their hands, the GHF had 4 stations, and it demanded that people go to them. So a completely different model of aid. And that hasn't solved the problem. These have become death traps, etc. And we can talk about those more. But that really is the background to the crisis that we're in today.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. That is a very helpful description of that chronology. And I think maybe one place that we can jump back to start, you talked about there's the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC. That's the international system for determining food crises. Then there's the FuseNet. I don't remember, Famine Early Warning System, I guess. And I want to actually ask first about the FuseNet. It is interesting. I mean, it's kind of hard for me to imagine another situation in which a government would step in and sort of have political reasons make it not issue a famine declaration when it was otherwise, determined by the experts involved. Do we have other cases from U.S. history where FuseNet determinations have been ignored in this way?
Sadly, there are. And the most shocking case in recent history was in Ethiopia just a few years ago. In 2021, the Ethiopian government was imposing a starvation siege on Tigray. And both FuseNet and the IPC were warning that famine was about to unfold. And the response of the Ethiopians was to not allow them to collect data. IPC was expelled. And what the Ethiopians then said was, oh, no data, there can't be a famine. And of course, it just meant the famine was unfolding in the dark. And there's a long history of this, actually. Pretty much every famine you look at in history, most of them have been caused by some political action or negligence. And usually those who caused them want to cover it up. Stalin in Ukraine prevented any journalists from going. The British in India forbade the use of the word famine. In governments around the world have always wanted to deny it. So sure. Israel is, I'm afraid, just the most recent in a long list of notorious examples of famine denialism.
Yeah, but more in particular, the FuseNet thing is an American system that issues these warnings. Has the U.S., in order to help another country, withheld one of these in the past, or modified, sort of brought political pressure to bear in the past like this?
The first time this ever happened was in December last year over Israel. So FuseNet, because it answers to the US, it can't be shut down by the government in Ethiopia or Sudan or wherever. But in December last year, FuseNet came out with a report saying famine conditions exist in northern Gaza. And it gave detailed explanation for why it thought this was so. The then US ambassador to Israel, this was still the Biden administration, of course, was very upset by this. He said, we have been doing our best to prevent famine conditions from occurring. And Israel was also upset. And for the first time ever in its 40-year history, FuseNet actually retracted a report. And then when the Trump administration came in, FuseNet was dissolved. And USAID was abolished. FuseNet ceased to exist. The contract is now being renewed with the private sector contractors who ran it. And it's given a sort of generic report, but it remains to be seen whether it will be properly up and running again.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm curious, I mean, one thing that comes up there as you're talking that comes up for me is this idea of the importance of the word famine, right? As opposed to just people are hungry or there's like starvation or there's mass problems, right? It's very interesting because that's, I think, been so much the locus of the debate that we've been seeing, especially in recent weeks, where there's been this argument from more pro-Israel voices that, well, there's been these warnings of like imminent famine, this or that, but there hasn't been famine. Maybe there is now. I guess like how do you think about the importance of systems like these that declare famine in particular versus other things, and how they can sort of be politicized by governments?
So it's a very interesting question. So the IPC system and FuseNet, I mean, their purpose actually is not to declare whether there's famine or not. Their purpose is to stop it, to prevent it. And for years and years, it basically worked. I mean, there were failures, but basically the system worked. So the idea was that the IPC or FuseNet, it has this 5 grades of food security. So phase 1 is normal, phase 2 is stressed, and then they put them on maps. So then green would be normal, yellow would be stressed. Phase 3 is crisis, and this is when you sort of want to alert the humanitarians, okay, you need to respond. You need to get things in there. You need to give people the capacity to stay on their land, not to sell their essential animals, not to wander off and eat, stop farming, etc. Phase 4 is emergency, and this is where kids are starting to die, where people are starting to abandon their land, where society is beginning to fray. And then phase 5 has 2 versions. One is catastrophe, which is when the food security indicators go, into real sort of, full alarm mode. People don't have anything. And then it counts as famine when you have that, and you have child malnutrition running at 30%, and you have death rates shooting up, according to various different measurements. And the point of this is to avoid getting to that last stage. And for the most part, it used to work. There used to be aid donors that would step up, USAID, but also, the Europeans, the Brits, other aid, the UN as a whole would step in and would ensure that a situation that was in crisis didn't get into emergency. And then we have this, bizarre phenomenon, which is that those who are causing famine, of course, want it to happen, but they don't want to be accused of it. So the sensitivities around it in Sudan, in Ethiopia, and now in Gaza are, we don't want to be accused of essentially of this crime. And that means that the IPC is doing a job that it really wasn't designed to do. It wasn't designed to give a verdict on what's happening. It was designed to stop it. And because in all these cases where it gets this bad, you can't get the proper data. Either there's too much social chaos, so you can't collect it, or the government is stopping it from being collected. What happens is that the IPC experts say, our best information tells us that famine is unfolding. So that's what they said with respect to Gaza this week. So it's a bit like going to a doctor. You go to a doctor and you have a condition, a fever or something, and the doctor immediately can tell pretty much what it is. Now, your doctor isn't going to hold off treating you until all the lab work is done, until all the tests have been done. They will do those tests, but the treatment will start right away. What we're facing at the moment is like Gaza is the patient, and the physician is saying, hold on, we'll let you continue down this track until we get all the lab work done. And then somebody is interfering with the lab work, saying, actually, this needs to be retested, it's not valid, etc. And meanwhile, the patient is dying in front of our eyes. And we all know, all of us who've worked in the humanitarian sector, we can see what's happening. And it's famine. There's no doubt about it.
Right. Right. And what is that? I guess paint a picture for listeners a little bit of what a famine means. Maybe basing from these sort of statistical things you're looking for, but like how many people are dying? What effects is this having on the ground for people living there?
So let's look first of all at the biological phenomenon of starvation. So as an individual, I mean, you and I are healthy adults. If we are completely deprived of food for about 50, 55 days, we will just get thinner and more gaunt, and our body will use up its fat. And then there'll become a tipping point at which the body begins to consume its own vital organs. And you will, depending on the exact pathology, your brain, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, your lungs, your intestinal lining will be affected. And it's a bit like, bankruptcy. It's slow, 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 and then fast. And with kids, it's much faster. For first of all, because there are, kids are younger, more vulnerable, etc. And also because the kinds of regular childhood infections, our kids in this country, they get coughs, wheezes, tummy upsets at home from school for a day. A severely malnourished child facing that could die. And that actually is a bigger killer than starvation, malnutrition as such. So this is what it looks like. And many of those very severely, acutely malnourished kids we see in pictures, they can't be healed with just food. They need to be in hospital. They need intensive care. But then let's look at the social phenomenon of starvation, because it is a collective experience too. It's that experience of social breakdown. And one of the things that is routinely written about by people who've experienced it, people who survivors of the Russian famines, of the siege of Leningrad, of concentration camps, etc., is the way in which they feel they are dehumanized, the way they feel that they are reduced to animals, that the essential sort of social functioning ceases. When you get, people scrabbling for food, fighting for food, selling their most treasured possessions, etc. And in a way, the sort of the social diagnosis of the moment of famine is around sharing food. So if you think of the family meeting around, for the dinner table, sharing food, that is the most elemental aspect of what it is to be human. But if instead of sharing food, you are fighting for food, you are hiding food, you are stealing food, that is when a society is tipped over. And not all society does that, but bit by bit, starting with the poorest and weakest, there's a sort of cascade of members of a community falling into this vortex of famine. And that is a sort of terrible, unmistakable syndrome of social collapse. And we've seen that in the most extreme cases of famine in modern history. And I fear that is what we are beginning to see happening today in Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when you talk about that, when you talk about the sort of social fabric fraying, the image that comes most to mind is all of these images that we've seen of people trying to get aid at these, Gaza Humanitarian Foundation sites. There's only a handful of them across the Gaza Strip. They only open for a few minutes at a time, and it seems to be a stampede. There's been, I think, over 1,000 deaths at them now. I guess it's such a stark image of that we've been facing over and over again lately.
Absolutely, and also around the UN aid distributions, and it's very, very difficult to keep order because the UN brings food to where people are, and consequently, they, it's every time one of those aid distributions goes in, it's very, very hard to keep order, to ensure that the food is allocated to those who need it.
Yeah.
And I think what you see, and we can discuss whether this is by accident or by design, is that this is survival of the fittest. Now, the use of starvation as a weapon of war against the civilian population is prohibited in international law. And the prohibition was formulated in 1977 in the Geneva Conventions. And one of the reasons why it was prohibited was that starvation had been a favored weapon of war, especially by Britain, France, and the US, the more powerful countries. And they'd used it in World War II. They'd used it in fighting colonial insurgencies, the French in Algeria, the British in Malaya. The British even called their Malaya counterinsurgency Operation Starvation.
Wow.
They were very candid about it. But it was prohibited basically after they abandoned their colonies and the US had withdrawn from Vietnam. And one of the reasons is that if you put a population under siege, and let's say it's 95% civilian and 5% armed men, the armed men are the last ones to starve. And I don't need to explain why. Basically, everybody else will starve before you get to the armed men. So, if you have an armed group embedded in a population, if you say, I want to starve the armed men, the insurgents, the terrorists or whatever, but you're going to starve everyone first. If you've isolated them in a garrison, or they're stuck out in the jungle and you've taken everyone out of the jungle, it's a different story. But if they're within the population, they will be the last ones to starve. And what we see, and so what the UN was trying to do was to bring food to the people so that people themselves would get it and the Hamas would get as little as possible. Now, one of the ironies, and this has to be intentional, the ironies of the GHF system. Israel said, we want this system to ensure that no food goes to Hamas. It actually knew that the UN system was not going to Hamas. So it said it was, but the US investigated. Last week, Reuters published a report. The US had investigated 156 incidents of looting or stealing of aid. No evidence that Hamas was involved at scale. These were either armed gangs, there were a couple of cases of corrupt contractors, etc. Hamas not doing it at scale. New York Times called up Israeli military officers. They confirmed, yeah, this is true. Hamas is not stealing UN aid at scale. But then you look at what happens at the GHF sites. So you have these boxes. You open the gates. There's this rush, a stampede. Who's at the front? It is healthy young men. They break open the boxes because one person can only carry one box. But they brought sacks with them. So they'll break open the box. They'll put what they want in the sacks. They'll leave some leftovers. They will make us. Then you'll see younger people, kids, women coming in, more frail people picking up what's left over. And then the contractors or the IDF will disperse this crowd using stun grenades or live ammunition, and they're pouring stories of people being killed. They call these, the GHF calls them secure distribution sites. Well, it's not safe for the people to go there. It's secure only for the aid commodities. But then the question arises, what happens to this food after it leaves? The GHF does not know who has taken it. And clearly those who are taking it are taking more than they want themselves. So are they selling it in the market? Are they storing it? Are they handing it over to Hamas? And who are they? Are these members of armed gangs? Are they members of Hamas? This is a system that if Hamas wanted to get its hands on the food, it would be delighted to see the GHF because it has every means of sending its own people there or getting the food, afterwards. So it is same with airdrops. If you see, an airdrop, who is going to be the one that congregates, who rushes to that the site of the airdrop, particularly because a lot of them are falling in combat zones. It's not going to be some, frail mother with her 4 kids venturing there to get the food. You can be pretty sure of that.
Right. Yeah, and I'm curious, well, I guess maybe one good topic to get into here while we're talking about GHF, which obviously Israel and the US now claim is necessary because they say that, like you said, that Hamas was stealing the UN things. There's also these sort of long-standing accusations on Israel's part that the UN Relief Works Agency, for example, UNRWA, other UN agencies are essentially compromised in some, in some way by armed groups on the ground, things like that. Can you talk about the evidence that they've provided for that accusation and whether there's anything to be taken seriously there?
The evidence is extraordinarily thin. I mean, they've made the Israel made allegations that a small number, I forget exactly how many, but a dozen or so, of UNRWA staff were involved in the October 7th atrocities. UNRWA immediately, I mean, UNRWA has had tens of thousands of staff. And it immediately investigated and suspended those. And it said, it went through a disciplinary and procedure. Obviously, it cannot prosecute them itself. It also accuses UNRWA of distributing educational books that it says are anti-Semitic. I don't really have the details on that. I mean, I think what I gather is that all the UN educational materials has to be approved by the Palestinian Authority. And of course, the Palestinian Authority, has been collaborating, has been a partner with Israel for more than 30 years. So, Israel ought to be surely addressing that through the Palestinian Authority. But which is supposedly its partner. The inspection regime, and the procedures for allowing UN vehicles to move are extraordinarily detailed, rigorous, and arbitrary. That it's all inspected. Anything that is dual use is prohibited. Anything that is not pre-approved is prohibited. There was a physician who went in recently, British doctor, and he took with him a lot of baby formula in his own luggage, and the Israelis took it out. They wouldn't allow him to take baby formula in. The Israeli allegations are taken very seriously by the UN, but frankly, the way they that minor mistakes and errors and cases of malfeasance and corruption have been inflated in order to block the entire effort is frankly unwarranted, and it speaks to ill intent on the part of Israel.
Yeah. Do we have a sense? It's difficult because obviously, as you've noted, it's hard to get data out of Gaza right now. There have been the health ministry in Gaza has started to give a little bit more detailed statistics around people dying from starvation or sort of related things. Do we have a sense of the scale of people who are dying from this, or is that something that we're realistically only going to find out once this is all done?
So a couple of points there. One is it was very the Gaza situation has been very unusual in that the way that the FuseNet and the IPC, they sort of model humanitarian emergencies is based upon some sort of assumptions about how the different indicators of food crisis and nutrition and mortality rule. And actually, it's been surprising how slow the nutrition and mortality indicators have been compared to the food crisis. We would have expected if this level of catastrophic food insecurity was measured in, say, South Sudan, the mortality levels would have been through the roof. Now, I think what this points to is that the population of Gaza was already before the conflict relatively well-nourished, and they had good health care, high levels of vaccination among children, etc. And also a resilient population, a lot of sharing of food, a lot of sharing of resources, a lot of solidarity. So these things have moved more slowly than they would have done in other, or we would have expected them to do in other cases. The Gaza Ministry of Health statistics, everyone agrees they're an undercount. Some people have very carefully monitored them and have compared the statistics, the lists they produce, with social media obituaries and so on. And the figure for violent deaths, trauma deaths, by the Gaza Ministry of Health, which now stands at about 60,000, is probably an undercount by about 40%. We're probably up to 40% more, 90,000 or 85, 90,000. And the same holds even more for the deaths from hunger and disease, particularly as most of the children who perish in famine don't actually die of hunger as such. They die of infections brought on by the living conditions, made worse by malnutrition. So what I fear is that the real figures are much higher. If we get a really good aid response in the coming weeks, we will know. But the worst case scenario is that after this is over, we will go and we will count the graves of all those children who died, and we will say, yes, this was the real death toll. And by then, of course, it's too late.
Right. And do we have a sense of, I guess, how exactly what a good response would look like? What would it take to go from where we are right now in this moment of clear crisis and go in and start to provide the necessary medical care and aid to the population that would allow the crisis to subside?
So let's go back a couple of months. In the middle of May, the UN had an action plan, resourced with all the capacity, with all these controls, etc. If the door had been open for the UN, along with the Red Crescent, international voluntary agencies, if they had been able to do that at time, there would have been enough basic food, enough supplementary food for moderately malnourished children. There would have been supplies for hospitals. There would have been some restoration of essential services, clean water, electricity, not enough. Not enough in terms of rehabilitating hospitals. So at least the basics would have been there. That plan is still on the table. And it needs to happen, because it needs to happen to meet those needs. But the problem is, because it didn't happen, we're now in a new stage. So I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands of children in Gaza have reached that stage of severe acute malnutrition, where just regular food is dangerous for them, where even those therapeutic foods, those specialized foods for young kids, aren't going to be enough. These kids need to be in the ICU. These kids need to be in hospital. Now, in the thousands or tens of thousands. And for a functioning hospital, you need, the hospital infrastructure needs massively to be expanded. The number of beds, the number of intravenous drips, the number of intensive care units, the number of nurses and physicians and other technical staff needed to administer this. And those staff need to have the facilities. They need to have reliable supplies of water and electricity. They need also to be able to support the parents. No mother who let's say has one child who's severely ill and three who are just moderately malnourished. She can't abandon those three and spend all the time with the kid in ICU, because they need her more than ever in the current situation. And the doctors and nurses, they need to be fed. They need to be rested. They need not to be living in fear. Their families they need to know that their families are supported. So you need far more today than you would have needed even 2 months ago in order to arrest this crisis. And if it goes on for another week or 2 weeks, we will need even more. We may get to the stage in a month or 2 months where essentially the whole of Gaza needs to be an intensive care unit. And that cannot be affected That cannot be achieved by the type of distribution of aid, or bringing out medical evacuation of a handful of the worst cases. Speed is important not just to save individuals, but to stop the whole of Gazan society being sucked into this sort of vortex of accelerating immiseration.
Right. And Israeli officials have claimed, obviously, in recent weeks that they've expanded the provision of aid, that they've allowed more trucks to get in and more checkpoints and things like that. Have we seen a significant increase in the provision of aid from what you can see?
Well, I was just looking at the data today.
This was a free preview of NonZero World. To unlock the rest of this conversation and other exclusive content, become an NZN member today at nonzero.org.